am a member of the digital humanities team here, so we're in professional services, so it's not quite the academic side, although we do academic support. But the other half of what I do is I've been publishing and performing poetry for about 10 years, and I'm about to finish my PhD in poetry. So I've got a sort of unique point of view from, we use AI all the time now in the university context, but everyone I encounter in the writing world is verging on hysterical if you bring it up. And I started looking at artificial intelligence as a tool in the creation of poetry in 2011 when I hosted a talk in conversation with Charlotte Keeter, who is a poet who won the Right Review Poetry Prize in 2011. And at the time, Charlotte was experimenting with how we could use AI as a co-author for poetry. So she would make her own using a collab notebook that someone had tacked together. She would feed GPT-2 at the time some prompts and then harvest those prompts and either use them as a jumping off point to create a new poem or use it basically as a writer to work in collaboration with. So she published a pamphlet of poetry by Charlotte Keeter and GPT-2, as if it was an author. You can scan the QR code here if you want to see the talk. It's just over an hour long. There's lots of practical examples of her actually in real time composing poems with the system. But I think the important thing is in 2011, no, not 2011, yeah, oh my god, 2021. That's a typo, I am younger than that.
You weren't working, you were at school.
But yeah, the systems we were using then are nothing like what we have now. So when I was going around the university saying, oh yeah, I'm working on doing poetry and AI, and people were saying, oh, isn't that scary? Isn't that going to make writing really difficult? Isn't that going to make assessment hard? And I was like, no, I've seen it. It's actually really wonky. It's just a tool that you can use in collaboration with other things. And I was kind of given it a hard sell. I did a presentation in 2022 where I was sort of showing the library senior leadership team different AI tools they could experiment with. I was getting them to write a poem with me on my laptop. And then about 2 months after that, ChatGPT came out, and I was hoping you all would remember what I'd done. Because suddenly it's completely different, and the questions have changed, not just the answers. And today I'm going to have a look at a few of the sort of issues and questions around the creation of poetry in a sort of academic setting, so both teaching and producing. It's not really an academic paper, it is a little more informal, and it's very much from my perspective, because that's the only one I have. So I think there are 2 areas that really interest me in this. And the first area is the question of authorship. So that might seem sort of self-explanatory when you're trying to answer who wrote something, and with an academic essay or even with a piece of prose, it kind of is self-explanatory. The person who wrote it wrote it. But with poetry, it's actually a bit more complicated. So I'm just going to have a look at a few examples of sort of why that is a bit murkier of a question, and whether AI actually fits in as, can you say a poem you wrote with AI is a poem you wrote? So the Academy of American Poets describes found poetry as poems that take existing texts and refashion them, reorder them, present them differently. So it's kind of a collage of existing works. Or a pure found poem is actually just intact text that's been restructured through line breaks. So found poetry isn't actually written by the person who writes the poem. So for example, Ashbery's To a Waterfowl, you can see as the poem, the sort of tone is consistent, it kind of makes sense as a poem. If you just saw that on its own, I don't think you would think, oh, that's a lot of stuff cobbled together that John Ashbery didn't write, but actually not one word in the poem was written by Ashbery. It's assembled from poems by pretty well-known poets through the course of history, but this is a John Ashbery poem. That's not ever sort of in doubt. Found poetry is the poet's poem, because they found these things, assembled them in their own way, and made a new thing. But that's what ChatGPT does as well. So maybe that's not the answer then, that's not the difference. To an even greater extent, things like testimony, this is by Charles Resnikoff, who was a lawyer and a poet, assembled hundreds of poems from just legal documents. None of this has been altered, none of it's been taken out of context or moved. The only thing that's been changed is he has put line breaks in so that it looks like a poem or reads like a poem. So the meaning is being created by the line break. But this isn't, these aren't his words, it's his context, but yeah, that's actually less original in terms of novelty than an AI poem would be. And then, this is an example for classroom teaching. It's not particularly good quality as a poem, but blackout poetry is another way. People can use words that aren't their own by erasing areas of text and leaving words that maybe weren't highlighted in the original text and picking them out so that the words that remain have a new meaning. You can create a poem that just recontextualizes existing words, but the order's not being changed. So you don't actually have to have written the poem to have written a poem. So how do we determine who the author is? Is it the human element? Is it the fact that a person has gone and found these things that feed into the poem and assembled them themselves, and there's no machine involved? It's kind of manual, it's sort of analog, it's part of a tradition. Well, poets do use computers in composition, even when AI is not involved. This is a spreadsheet I made because there are rhyme schemes that are very complex, and orders that things have to come in, and automating that can be a way to make the writing process easier. And this, I don't know if it's cheating or not, but essentially what I've done is I've used formulas to auto-fill in the lines that repeat through a villanelle, and then I've put in little hints so I know which word should rhyme, so that it's really easy then to actually do quite a difficult writing form with the use of a computer tool. So for an example, I've used quite a well-known villanelle, which is a Sylvia Plath poem, and the bolded lines are ones the spreadsheet has just filled in for me. So you can see that quite sort of irregular, difficult rhyme scheme has been filled in by a computer. So if the difference isn't that someone's written the lines, and the difference isn't that someone hasn't used a computer to help with the form, like how do you determine authorship and whether a poem's actually been written by a person, and then how does AI fit in with that? The second point is an ethical point, which kind of answers that question, I think, for me. Obviously, the context of poetry is its own context, and this won't apply to every discipline, or even other art disciplines. ChatGPT, I asked Google, what is ChatGPT? Which is what a lot of people in the arts would ask me. I year ago. And it says you can get access to a super smart chatbot trained on a huge set of data. Well, where's that huge set of data coming from? Because all the previous poems we looked at, they come from data sets too. They're just printed. They're novels, they're books of poetry. Oh, so ChatGPT pulls from, you will know this, but pulls from wikis, books, journals, social media, pulls blogs. So it's definitely pulling other poets' work because, blogs, Twitter, even Instagram, that's where most contemporary poets who are working in publishing are putting their work, unless they're getting published in journals, which often are online anyway. So, okay, it is pulling from other poets' work, that's fine. That's what the other poems we looked at today do. But, at least we can cite them. It's all on the computer. We actually can't. The way AI works isn't that it will tell you where it got that information. It mixes it all up and then churns something new out based on similarity. So there is actually no way to reference whose work you'll be contextualizing and using. So it's kind of contextless, and also means in an academic setting, there is absolutely no way to use AI to create a poem that doesn't actually meet the definition of plagiarism within a university setting, because you can't cite or reference the people whose work has been used to produce the new work. And the difference between the AI-generated poetry and the poems we looked at before, I've sort of come to the definition for myself, is they lack the authorial intention of selecting and the context of the earlier pieces being used to sort of create new contextual meaning. So the intertextuality of using an existing piece and harvesting work from it, there's still a thought process behind that and a reason that specific work has been used. And with generative AI, there's just no way that you can have that extra context and that extra level of perspective, even aside from the plagiarism thing. I have one final point that is specific to creating poetry in a university setting in sort of the humanities. And that is, do you remember this a few years ago? Swansea University announced we were going to do decolonised humanities. We've still got a decolonising knowledge journal club. There is increasingly a very politicised student base, particularly in the humanities, who are calling for decolonised education, particularly in literature, particularly in creative writing. And our university has committed to that with several elements of the humanities curriculum. And the university itself has committed to action on the climate emergency. ChatGPT, every time it's used to write a poem, every time it's used to create multiple prompts, significant amounts of water it consumes, including when generating text. So for a simple conversation of 20 to 50 questions, the water consumed is equivalent to a 500 milliliter bottle. So the actual water footprint, if people are going to use this on a large scale creatively, is not insignificant. And the climate crisis is a global issue that disproportionately affects the global south. I do have references for all of this that I can share. And this is totally individual, whether you care about this or not, or think it impacts your particular field of study. But if we actually want to decolonise the curriculum and teach in sort of an equitable, sort of ethically justifiable way, it's impossible to decolonise the curriculum if we're using generative AI within that curriculum, because of the disproportionate impact on the global south of these tools, or at least to do that uncritically without thinking about it and really assessing whether that's worth it or not. Once again, I'm not saying we shouldn't use it and that it's demonic and bad. I'm sure it's really, there are ways it can be used in a collaborative, thoughtful way, but it's just something to think about. So my conclusions are the use of AI presents poets and poetry scholars with an opportunity to question the nature of authorship and what writing a poem actually is. There are interesting and novel ways to use technology in the creation of poetic work. I think poetry especially is an experimental medium where you can try new things. So I'm not, I certainly don't want to seem like a Luddite who just doesn't want to use this stuff. I've really looked into it over a course of years, and these are just sort of ideas and thoughts. But especially with poetry embedded in a university context, we do need to be aware of the wider societal impact of the use of these tools, particularly within curricula that have decided to at least purport to have a social conscience. So that is it.
We have some questions. Start with Troy.
Well, it's not really a question, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to say thank you for mentioning the climate cost of generative AI and other tools like this. It's something that is so rarely mentioned, and in my opinion, it's the biggest problem with it. It's never mind that it's destroying education or artistic integrity. It's going to literally kill our planet if we keep pumping so much energy into these things. It needs to be a part of every single conversation, and I think that decolonising the curriculum is a really good one to make an argument as well, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think especially, it's not that we need to just vow never to use it. It's one of those things that I think maybe just an increased awareness of the costs that people can weigh up. Is this a justifiable use of the technology? Is it worth the cost? Rather than never using it, because I don't think that's practical in the sector especially.
Well,
yeah. One of the most important news stories I saw last year, November last year, and it got almost no attention. But Amazon suddenly decided to stop authors from uploading more than 3 books a day. It took me 4 years to write my last one, and this blew my mind, and it got almost no attention. Is there any hope or future for human creativity?
nice small question.
I actually think, in the specific discipline I'm in, poetry, I think there is, because there is no money in poetry anyway, so it's not like we're having money taken away from us by poems being, farmed out to. If you like poetry, you are a bit weird. You're a bit intense. You're not in it for money, and you're not in it for ease of creation. People who read poetry are the same. It's just not. I don't particularly think it will be massively impacted by AI in that sense. I think the teaching aspect is the same as anyone has said today for other disciplines, but I think just for the creation of poetry, particularly with it's in a very STEM heavy room. I don't like to say this, but there is a kind of unmeasurable human thing that does exist that I think is part of making art, and I do think people, particularly non-casual readers who are very passionate about their media, do want that, and I think particularly with poetry that I have seen that bear out so far anyway.
You made a really good point about creativity and poetry being somewhat immune because there is no money. Okay? But if there is money in other disciplines, in other parts of the world, I don't know, creativity is needed in engineering to make bridges that look good and that are useful and stuff. What about creativity in this domain, if money is involved?
To be honest, that's kind of outside my remit. I literally just know about poetry. No, I think obviously those disciplines are very different, especially with engineering. There is such a financial aspect to that as a field. I used to work in the College of Engineering. It's very, very different. But yeah, I do not know about the impact of AI on creativity in more commercial art forms. It's purely in the discipline I'm in. I can only really speak to that, but thank you.
Yeah.
I write poetry, and it's now interestingly reading anything longer than a few pages of computer-generated like poetry, like there's something to be said for the process, the organic process of writing, that's what, from scratch. And I think maybe the same for learning, like I can understand the pressures of people doing medical degree to pass and get out, but there is a pleasure to learning from scratch, and that's really lost in like shortcut tools and AI. And then I wanted to ask you about the hysterical poets who, because I think I can see they don't want to use these tools, they're not interested because they really want to write their poems from scratch because that's what's pleasurable about writing poetry. But then does that create a sort of fear of AI?
Yes, and I think it's important to have a slightly more open mind than just being like, I don't like it, it's going to take my job or my hobby and I'm scared of it, so I'm not going to engage with it because it's not going to go anywhere. So I think it does definitely create a fear, and it, in writing circles, like on social media, for example, it's kind of a blanket thing where if someone's used AI for something, it's like, we won't contribute to this. This is used AI for the cover arts and nobody submit. Like, people are really, really very against AI, almost in the language of like a boycott, like a political boycott almost. And I don't really think that, particularly in an academic context where most poets who are working and regularly sort of going for awards and regularly publishing and performing are embedded in universities to some extent, because that's really the only way you can make sort of a decent living as a poet being your primary job, is teaching creative writing or teaching literature or working in a university environment. And there is simply no way to avoid AI if you're in that environment. So I think having maybe more of a critical eye and just being open to thinking about it. So I kind of have come to the conclusion that I don't really think you can write poetry properly with generative AI. But I have tried to explore it and tried to use it and looked into it, because I think it's not going to not be there and not be used just because I've got some ethical objection to it or whatever. So I think we can't avoid it completely, and even if we've got objections to it, we should at least try and know about it. It's kind of, I don't know if that's an answer. Yeah.
Thanks to Moriarty.